The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hello everybody. Welcome to Unit 6. I'm just wanting to make sure that I'm being heard. So welcome all throughout Queensland. So could I ask people just to go to the question box and type in clear or something like that? Just let me know that I'm being heard because I don't want to go through the whole exercise. Oh, wow, that's great. Thanks, loud and clear. Thanks, Catherine. Clear. Thanks, Judy. Thanks, Ben. Thank you, Mary. Okay, it sounds like I'm coming across loud and clear. All right, so look, the normal process is that if you've got questions or comments or observations, you can type them into that question box there, and what I'll do is I'll stop the broadcast at that time and respond to your comment or question. Now, bear in mind, of course, I'm the only one that sees the questions, so nobody else will see those questions. I just thought I'd make that clear to you. All right, so I realise that this is Thursday before Easter, so I'll certainly, I'm sure everybody's looking forward to their nice Easter break, but let's move on and look at some of the things that we'll be covering in our session. Now, the first thing I want to say is we are now at the end of our series, and I hope that you've got something useful out of the process. So I thought I might just spend a few minutes recapping on some of the key takeouts from those 6 units, well, the 5 units, and of course we'll be covering number 6 today. So way back, seems like a long time ago now, at the beginning of the process in January, we looked at the ingredients of effective feedback. And I guess what I was suggesting to you is that it would be really important to find 3 opportunities each day to give feedback. It doesn't have to be terribly long, doesn't have to be negative either, it can be positive. And to actually give people that feedback. So I hope if you've lost the habit of doing that, I hope you can get back into it after Easter, perhaps, or this afternoon. And then in Unit 2, we looked at influencing capabilities, and you completed an influencing profile, which basically gave you an opportunity to understand how you like to influence other people and as well be influenced yourself. And I guess my whole emphasis on module or Unit 2 was to suggest to you that if you want to improve your capacity to persuade people, the critical thing to do, of course, is to use all 4 strategies. Now, you might recall the strategies were investigation and calculation. Now, both of those are logical approaches to influence. And there's motivation and collaboration, which is more of an emotional approach to influence. And the key is that each of us have got a predisposition to one of those 4. And what happens is that we will tend to use them too often. So the key is if plan A doesn't work, of course, you can try plan B or even C or even D. So the trick is to be flexible in terms of how you want to influence other people. Now in Unit 6, we looked at optimizing team performance, and I guess my key point out of that is to build your capacity to have good, constructive, regular conversations with the people that you lead. And I was hoping that you may have got into the habit at this stage of having regular catch-ups with each of your team members one-on-one. And I was keen to hear if anyone has any feedback about that, because I know it works really, really well. Those meetings don't have to be long. They can be 15 minutes once a fortnight, but it just keeps people in the loop and gives people a chance to talk about things that they want to talk about. It gives you a chance to develop a better working relationship with each member of your team member. And ultimately, it's about building trust, so that by having a high level of trust with your team members, you will automatically have more influence as a result of that, because people trust you. It's as simple as that. But you can't do that unless you have that one-on-one interaction with people. And I'm not talking about a project or a report or something that council wants. I'm talking specifically about building developmental conversations with the people that you lead. So in Module 4, we looked at getting the very best from the people that you lead. Now, I did share with you a number of different motivational theories, and of course, there isn't one out there that says this is the one size fits all. Of course, it very much depends on who you're dealing with and how you like to operate yourself. But I think the essence of Unit 4 was Daniel Pink's small framework, which really talked about knowledge workers. And knowledge workers, of course, are people working with knowledge each day and information. And most of you in this broadcast are dealing with knowledge workers. But knowledge workers need three things out of their work, essentially. They need autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And essentially what Daniel Pink was referring to is autonomy in the sense that people want to feel as if they can plan their work without being micromanaged and work out their schedule of priorities and so forth. Mastery refers to the capacity to continually grow and develop and become more skilled in the work that you do. And purpose really refers to having a line of sight between the task that you do and the end result. So in local government, of course, there's lots and lots of tasks that take place that perhaps don't seem to have any connection to the strategic direction of the organisation. The leader's role is, of course, to make that connection, connect the dots between what people do and what the end result is. So I think if you do those three things, provide people with autonomy, mastery and purpose, you'll be going a long way to creating the motivational climate for people to make a decision about whether or not they become motivated, because ultimately, as you know, it's their choice about whether they want to be engaged or not. But it's the leader's opportunity to create the environment where engagement is more likely, and essentially that was a good framework. In Unit 5, we looked at understanding people and their personalities, and we were doing that for a bit of fun, but essentially the message was fairly important, and that is treat people how they want to be treated, not treat people how you want to be treated. So in other words, the golden rule is treat people how you want to be treated. The platinum rule, on the other hand, is treat people how they want to be treated. And what that basically means is understand their personality type and understand their orientation, and if you can, is to accommodate that as much as you can, and you'll find that you'll get great results. So it's always interesting to look around the office and work out who's an owl, a bull, a peacock, and a lamb. And sometimes it's difficult, and the point being is that if it's difficult, it's probably likely that if they did the survey, and that's the other online survey we did, if they did the survey, it's probably likely that they would have fairly even scores across the bottom. And of course, there are other people in your organisation that very clearly fit the category of the bull, the owl, the lamb, or the peacock. And then today, of course, we're going to look at facilitating effective meetings. And you might say, well, why are we doing that? I would argue that one of the most important things that a leader should be able to do is to run meetings, because they're costly, and at the end of the day, we all attend a lot of meetings that are not much fun. And I'm not suggesting we make them fun only, but there's no point in attending unproductive, boring, stale meetings. I just don't get why we do that. And you and I both know, you probably more than me, local government is notorious for having boring, stale meetings. So what we want to try and do is to spruce that up, and I've got a few ideas that I want to help you with during this broadcast. So, of course, your homework from last time a fortnight ago, was to start dealing with people according to their personality types as much as you can. The argument being that you'll often get better results if you do that. So I hope you've had a chance to do that. And of course, the rule out of all of that was, as I said, treat people how they want to be treated, not so much treat people how you want to be treated, which of course is the golden rule. Okay, so what are we going to be covering today? Well, four things essentially. We're going to talk about the context of meetings. So what types of meetings are out there? I'm going to give you a bit of a framework so that you can perhaps look at classifying some of your meetings. We're going to look at the structure of meetings and how they might best be structured to help you, some interpersonal and leadership skills that you might be requiring in order to be more effective in chairing meetings, and some ideas to enrich your meetings and make them more interesting and enjoyable and productive. So essentially there are 4 things that we'll do in this short session. Okay, so let's get underway. And I would argue, and you might say, well, look, I have 6 units that I could cover in this Lunch and Learn series. There is myriad things that I could include in this series, but I've decided to include meetings, running effective meetings, because of this very statement that I have in front of you, and that is that I believe that getting good at running productive meetings is one of the most critical and untapped skills of any leader. Now, I don't know whether you agree with me or not about that, but if you just think about the number of meetings you attend, think about the number of meetings that you might even run, it's considerable. And not only is that meeting involving you, it's involving a whole bunch of other people. So in fact, what is the case is it's a very costly exercise. It's not a line item in the budget, of course, but there is costs. You get 6 people in a room and you meet for an hour. It's really not 6 hours of time. It's really 12 hours, because while they're sitting in the room, they're not doing something else. So it becomes an extremely expensive exercise. So it seems to me to be quite logical that being good at that is a reasonable expectation for any leader. So I'm going to challenge you to apply some of the things that you've learned today and to make your meetings even more effective than they currently are. And of course, if you're not running meetings, trust me, there won't be long before you will, and that's for sure. Now, here's another statement I want to make, and I just want to give some insight into meetings themselves. I want to make the comment that meetings themselves are not productive. It's actually what happens or doesn't happen between meetings that determines the effectiveness of the meeting. So meetings themselves are not productive. So really, what we're doing in meetings is aligning priorities, meeting expectations, reporting on progress, making decisions for the future, perhaps even reflecting on the past. But the reality is, it's what happens at the end of the meeting, in between that meeting and the next one, that determines whether that meeting's been successful. So in other words, you can have a very enjoyable, engaging, and even, dare I say, productive meeting, which means that everyone feels they've got a lot done in the meeting, and then nothing actually happens out of the meeting. We've all been to those meetings. So we walk out of the meeting and nothing's actually done. Nothing's changed. And of course, the morale drops off, and the next time you come to the meeting, you're a little less enthusiastic about the meeting because nothing's happened in between. So it's really important that we gear meetings up for the preparation for what happens between them. So that's not just a case of circulating a bunch of minutes. It's a lot more than that. But I think it's important for us to understand. So if you take the Lunch and Learn series, you could argue that what we're doing right now is a meeting. Now, if you decide to do absolutely nothing out of today's 1-hour broadcast, so you don't apply any of the skills that you've learned today in terms of running more effective meetings, then you'd have to say that this has been a waste of time, because nothing's changed. And it's also cost you 2 hours, obviously the hour that you're sitting here listening to me, but also the hour in terms of what you could be doing somewhere else in the organisation. Now, here's a list or category, if you like, of the types of meetings that we go to or we organise. Now, there is, of course, some crossover. I've just put some categories down here, but the reality is one meeting could probably include 3 or 4 of these, depending on the nature of the meeting. But let's go through them. So there's information meetings. Now, and some of you might remember this if you're in local government, during the amalgamation, There were lots of meetings all over the place about what's happening, how's this amalgamation going to work, what councils are involved, what councils are not involved, and so forth. Of course, there wasn't a lot of information around in those times, and I have said in the past I was reasonably critical of the way it was done, but nevertheless, that was an opportunity in local government where information meetings would have been extremely relevant. Now, you might say, what's the difference between that and education meetings? Well, education meetings are probably more around training. So this is more around skill development and capability enhancement. So when you go to a training course or you learn a particular skill, maybe it's a technical skill or a soft skill or something like that, that meeting is probably likely to be an education meeting. So you could argue that what we're doing today is an education meeting. Now, a clarifying meeting is a meeting where we might get a group of people together to clarify our direction and expectations. So, for example, if you have a new team or you've been moved into another section and all of a sudden you have a new team, it's probably a good idea at some point to sit down with that team and let people know what your expectations are of them, and perhaps even be humble enough to ask them what their expectations of you are. So that would be a clarifying meeting. That would be a meeting where we understand where we know where we stand with other people. And unfortunately, we don't have enough of these meetings, particularly in local government, I think, where we make assumptions about clarity. But often the information flow from council through senior officers, through middle management, through coordinators to workforce is not as clear as it could be. And I think sometimes because we're so busy being busy, we forget to clarify where we are. And then, of course, later on we find that the ground shifted, or it hasn't really. It's just that we didn't know what the ground was in the first place. Now, another type of meeting is an engagement meeting. Now, that's a meeting where you want to get everybody engaged in a project or something or other. So let's say there's a new customer relationship system that's implemented in your council, and you are in the customer service area and you decide to get your team together to engage them in solutions about how they might use this system, or at least make the transition from the old system to the new system. Well, that would be an engagement meeting because everybody's engaged in the problem. Everyone's got a piece of the action. Everyone will probably have something useful to add to the meeting. So that would be what I refer to. But it also could be a solving collective problems meeting, because a solving collective problems meeting is we might have had a huge blow up with ratepayers, or council have decided in their wisdom that there is a certain priority that's needed, and all of a sudden the ground shifted and you need to get your team together to kind of work out a strategy about how you might deal with this. So that would be an example of a solve a collective problem type meeting. Of course, review meetings are very common in local government, and that is where we actually come together either monthly, fortnightly, or weekly, and we talk about where we're up to. In other words, a work in progress type meeting. And that can be very informative for everybody around the table because we know where everybody's up to, what they've done, or perhaps what they've not done, and we can quiz people about that. And the final type of meeting is a collaborative decision-making meeting where you want everybody engaged in the solution. So this might be a meeting where everybody has to have a say. You want everyone to be on board and committed to whatever the outcome is. The very best way to get people to on board and commit is, of course, to get them to make the decision collectively. So that might be a making decisions meeting, or it might be just that you want feedback. And so you yourself will make the decision, but ultimately you're calling upon your team resources to guide and inform you in that decision-making process. So you can see that there are lots of different types of meetings. So you might want to think, well, how many meetings do I attend that are information meetings, clarity meetings, engagement meetings, and so forth? You'll probably find that when you think about it, there's quite a lot of all of those things. And of course, as I said before, Some meetings, of course, are a combination of several things. But it's probably not a good idea to muddy the waters too much. If we're not clear about what sort of meeting we're having, then it's likely it's not going to be a very effective meeting. So when you plan your meetings, can you confidently say, look, this is a meeting to engage people, or this is a meeting to collectively problem solve on a critical incident that occurred last Monday? You need to be able to say that first and foremost, because if you can't, then it's likely that the meeting's objectives and where you're going is probably not going to be as clear as you would like it to be. All right, so what I want to do now before we move on is just talk about the costs of meetings. A lot of people, I rattle on a lot about the cost of meetings, but I'm not sure that it sinks in. Have a think about this. Think about your team, right? Only your team. There's no point in thinking anything beyond that at the moment. And what I'd like you to think about is these parameters. Now, you can't probably work this out now, but you could certainly do this exercise later, and it would certainly be a very informative exercise to do. So what's the average income of your team paid per hour? So if you work out, what would you say average that would be? How many meetings on average do your team members attend per week? And that wouldn't be difficult to work out. If you share calendars, that'll be very obvious. But if you don't, of course, it's just a case of asking. And most people will remember, with a bit of prompting, what the meetings were during the last week. And then typically, how long did each of those meetings last? So most council meetings, of course, go for quite a distance of time. But how long do your meetings go for? Or how long do your team members' meetings go for? How many are in the team? So how big is your team? And then what you do is you then multiply that by 2, because while people are attending meetings, of course, they can't fully attend to the other functions of their role while they're sitting in the meeting. So it becomes costly, not just for the hour or 2 hours or 3 hours that they spend in the meeting, but the 1 hour, the 2 hours or the 3 hours they're lost, not being able to work on other activities or key result areas. Let me put some figures around this that might help you. So let's say, for example, that the average hourly rate for the people working your team is $31.25. All right, let's just assume that that's the case. Let's assume that each one of your team members has 5 meetings per week. So you've done a bit of an audit and that's what it's told you. So these figures aren't terribly, they're quite conservative. How long has the meetings lasted? Well, let's say on average 2 hours, some shorter, some longer. We've now got 10 hours per person at $31.25 per hour. So how many in the team? Let's say we've got 6 people in our team. And obviously you need to double that cost. So would you like to have a guess at how much that's costing you per year? 6 people with that number of meetings, which is probably pretty typical. Any ideas? All right, so here's the cost. For 6 people meeting like that over the course of a year, it's going to cost you $195,000 a year. And that's a conservative figure. Now, that in itself is not a big concern. The question is, are we getting value for that $195,000? And if you looking after budgets, if you had a line item that said $195,000 in your budget from last year and you're new to the team, and it just said after it meetings, you might then ask the question, what are these meetings about? Were they necessary? What was this all about? And so what that does is it gives, of course you would question that, and so who wouldn't? look at it and in a bit more of an extreme case. Now, some of your councils that are in this forum today have over 1,000 people, employees. So let's consider those figures at the bottom, and let's just change the figure that let's say that there are 1,000 people in the council, and let's say that's the figure at the end of the year. So if you work on the figures at the bottom, it works out to be $32.5 million a year in meeting costs, right? That's 1,000 people with those characteristics. Again, if you were in accounts in your organisation and you're going through the organisational budget, and there was a line item there of 32.5 million, and after it there was meetings, you would question it. You would ask, what's this all about? They must have been good meetings if that was the cost, blah, blah, blah. So I guess what I'm trying to do is to sensitise you to the fact that meetings do cost a lot of money, and you might like to actually do this exercise yourself within your team, and just to point out that, unless there's a very good reason to meet, unless there's a very good meeting set up and there's an agenda and so forth, then it's probably not worth our while to meet. So now I'd like to turn to some of the skills that you could use in meetings that become quite effective. So there's a lot of talk about rotating the chair at meetings, and frankly, some of you might be doing that. I am against it. I don't believe in it. I think that what it does is more negative than good, because by rotating the chair, what you're doing is abrogating the responsibilities of running the meeting. I get that, but I understand that there's a more altruistic reason for doing it, and that is to get people more engaged in the meeting so that everyone has a chance to contribute to the meeting. Now, the problem with that is that many people dread chairing meetings. So once it's their turn, they absolutely dread it. They're probably not going to be very good at running the meeting, and moreover, they can't remember or learn anything from that because they're dreading the whole experience, plus the fact that everyone else in the meeting is probably dreading them chairing the meeting anyway because it's probably not going to be a great meeting, and you may end up being the de facto chair anyway. So it loses its potency. So I think if you accept that chairing meetings or running meetings, whatever you want to call it, is your core responsibility, then my suggestion is that you do it all the time. I actually know of a CEO in a local government organisation, which I won't mention, of course, who was chairing the meeting at the executive level, and I suggested to him to take that responsibility back, and he came back to me later and said, yeah, you're right, it is my job, and I feel much more comfortable doing that job. But so I don't think it's a good idea, and I'd be interested to hear your point of view. But look, I'm not suggesting it can't work, but I just don't know whether it's a great plan. I think there are minuses that come out of it that are probably greater than the pluses that come out of it. Now, in local government, we're notorious for this. The balance between reporting and discussing is skewed very heavily in the favour of reporting. So we tend to have meetings that, where we go around the table and everyone gives their piece and a bit of a report on what happened in the previous meeting and so forth. And then that's 80% of the meeting. And then the other 20% might be a bit of general business and maybe even time for a bit of discussion. So I don't think that's a very good use of our time. I'd like to see you and everybody in local government using more discussion time in meetings, talking about real life situations, how things will be dealt, what people's opinions are about such and such. And I think that you can do that. In fact, I would argue that the best meetings are 50-50, 50% reporting and 50% discussion. To me, that would be the ultimate. So that means you might have to ask people to be briefer in their reporting. Perhaps you can lead the way there. Perhaps give them time limits, whatever it might work for you. And perhaps just focus on their key performance indicators. Now, people will often use their presentation in a meeting as a grandstanding opportunity, and I understand that happens. but that's the whole point. I'm trying to get a balance between reporting and discussion. So that's one thing I'd like you to do. You might say, well, what are we going to discuss? Well, I'm sure there's plenty of things. A critical incident that occurred last week, um, some changes in approach and methodology, perhaps have a conversation about continuous improvement, have a conversation about culture. There's a lot of things you can talk about and should talk about in your team meetings. Now, it's very important, I think, to talk about critical incidents. Now, you might recall, I think it was in module 3 when we were talking about getting the best out of your team. In fact, it was module 1 as well. I suggested that the best forms of feedback were where you could use a critical incident to point out the person if something positive or negative. I think it's the same with a meeting too. Use critical incidents to use them as the platform for discussion. So if some incident occurred last week or council's very upset about something and wants, some more information about X, whatever it might be, and these things come out of the blue, as you know, then why don't you take up half your meeting talking about that incident, not just to whinge about it and who was to blame and where can we apportion blame, but more so around what could we have done differently, what will we commit to doing in the future, what suggestions and ideas might we have for moving forward. That's what I'm talking about. And let's face it, there's plenty of critical incidents in local government to keep you busy discussing those around the table. So use critical incidents. I think they can be very, very insightful. And of course, this is important not to be using it as a finger pointing exercise. If somebody is going to be embarrassed about the discussion about a critical incident, you might like not to use it. And then again, you might like to use it and get the consent of the person who was involved and to reassure them that this is not a witch hunt and really all we're trying to do is to learn something for the future. So it's up to you, but certainly critical incidents are very, very powerful. The other thing I'd like you to think about in terms of your meetings is to clarify roles. Now, you might think that everyone in your team knows intimately what everyone else does for a job. They might be working in an open office environment, they probably are. But you'd be very surprised if you did a little audit on this. For example, if you pulled someone aside and you said to them, what do you think my primary role is? I think you might be surprised and disappointed about what you get back. In other words, I think we all overestimate what other people know about the work that we do. So why not use the meetings to clarify roles? Now, how you do that is very simple. You simply ask each person in the team in the next meeting for 2 minutes, doesn't have to be any longer, just to highlight what the key or core priorities are in their work and how they go about meeting those core priorities and how they actually measure their success. So it's 3 parts. And that can be very powerful. So the next month you have somebody different till you've rotated everyone around the table through a process of educating others, of course that is an education meeting, around what their role entails. Can be very, very powerful. And you can have that, tack that on as part of your normal get together. So I think it's important to do that. I mean, even cross-functionally, if you think about it, does everyone know what HR is supposed to do? Everyone thinks they know, but do they actually know? Does everyone know what marketing is responsible for? Does everyone know, for example, what accounts? What do they do each day? And of course, if we don't know, we fill the vacuum with information that's normally false. So there's your opportunity to clarify roles at the team level. Now, those of you who are working in the outdoors, and we've got a few in these presentations, this is probably particularly pertinent for you. So stand-up meetings are brilliant because usually when people are standing up, they'd rather be sitting down. So if they're standing up, you'll find something interesting happens, that the meetings will go a lot quicker because people won't tend to waffle. because it's a stand-up meeting, and that's precisely what you want. So at the beginning of the day, when you're allocating jobs and responsibilities, or at the end of the day when you're debriefing, a stand-up meeting can be very powerful. So why don't you try that? And the other thing is there's not giblets of paper floating around and so forth. So I think stand-up meetings have their place, particularly with outdoor staff, but I guess you could use it indoor as well. Now, I think it's fair to say if a meeting's worth having, it's worth having an agenda for. So now, of course, if you decide to meet spontaneously with somebody you didn't even know, you had no plan, no foresight, you need to sit down with that person. Well, obviously, you're not going to have an agenda. There'll be an agenda, but there won't be a written agenda. But if you are having regular catch-up meetings with your team, which I suspect you are, then you need to have an agenda for each meeting. It sends a courteous message to your team that you think it's sufficiently serious enough to plan for this meeting to have an agenda. In other words, people's time is valuable. Now, the agenda doesn't have to be very complicated. So it has to be, it can be, in fact, the simpler it is, the better. So what you do with an agenda is you itemize the things that need to be discussed, but the first couple of items should always be the most important. So the whole idea is you graduate from the most important to the least important items that need to be discussed. Those that don't get discussed can be rolled over to the next meeting, and you've already made the decision that they're not as important, so that's not a problem. But people's energy level is at the highest during the beginning of a meeting, so you need to tackle the big issues, the big fruit early on. So the other tip I'd give you around agendas that's very, very useful is that after each line item, you should put a number. So for example, I'm going to talk about the new customer relationship system. So I've got that on the agenda. There's a bit of information that I've gleaned from the vendor, and I want to share that with the team around training. But I also want to have some input about how it's going. But after the item, which is customer relationship CRS system, I might have 20 minutes in brackets. Now, that sends a signal to everybody else that I'm only going to spend 20 minutes on this item. Now, that's very useful because it forces you to move the pace along. You can do it legitimately by saying to people, we've only got 20 minutes of discussion for this, so please keep your contributions brief. All right, you can respectfully wind people up who might be long-winded by suggesting to them that we need to move on because we've only got 20 minutes on the topic. So it's a very powerful way of governing the meeting itself by having the number at the end of it. I'm not a huge believer in general business. By all means have it, but I've seen the comical situation where we've only spent about 5 minutes on work in progress and 65 minutes on general business. Usually it's an excuse for people to just make a contribution on the spur of the moment. I think it's far better to be planned and prepared for that. So if you send the agendas out early and actually ask for people for agenda items and so forth, if you get people to think through those things carefully before the meeting, and you can train people to do it, it's highly unlikely that you're going to need to spend much time on a general business item because, it's already been either in the agenda or discussed beforehand. So have agendas. They are important. And the other thing I'd say is at the end of the meeting, I think it's a really good idea to have somebody to summarize all the key points. Now, you might say that that's the minute taker, but it may not be. It may just be a case that somebody jots a few notes down under each of the topics on the agenda, and they basically give a quick overview of what was discussed. Now, that's a good thing because while people walk out, recency is a critically important thing. The most recent thing they remember is a summary of what happened in the meeting. And perhaps even in that summary might be a few things that people need to do as a result of that meeting. And then, of course, they can walk on their merry way. But so summaries are great at the end of meetings. And you know what? You've probably got someone in your team who's quite talented at drawing information together and distilling it down to one key message. And I'll guarantee you've got someone like that. So why not ask them to do it? They'll be absolutely delighted to do it because they have a natural aptitude for that, which is that strength-based psychology we touched on earlier. Now, of course, meeting effectiveness is usually diminishes the longer the meeting goes. So the whole idea, of course, as I said earlier, is to try to have your key agenda items up front because that's when the energy level is at the highest. That's where people are, their brains are in gear and they're ready to contribute. And then after a while, it starts to drop off significantly. So it's no point in having, a very difficult issue to discuss right at the end of the meeting when it could have been discussed up front when people's energy levels are higher. I think a good rule of thumb is an hour-long meeting. Any more than that is probably a little long. I think an hour is great. I mean, if you can't achieve something in an hour with a group of people, then frankly, 2 hours is probably not going to work either. So, but I think an hour-long meeting is a very good block of time to have most meetings. Now, what I want to do here is just talk a little bit around the setup of rooms because the setup of rooms can have a huge impact on meetings. And so this will give you an opportunity to start thinking about that a little bit more. So let's just look at that for a moment. Okay, so I'm obviously not being heard too well. Thanks, Catherine. Hello. Am I clearer now? Let's see. Maybe my speaker's not close enough. Could you just indicate if I'm coming across loud and clear now? Just type in something. Okay. I wonder if that means you can't hear me. Well, maybe I should. I all go. Okay, thanks, Judy. So it's okay where you are. Of course, this is going all over Queensland, so it could vary depending on where you are. Look, I'll just keep ploughing on. I don't know there's much more I can do, but well, you can turn the volume up on your machine. But at the end of the day, I realise there's obviously an internet issue somewhere out there. Anyway, let's keep ploughing on as much as we can. But thanks for pointing that out to me. I wouldn't have known otherwise. All right. So look, I'll do this clockwise. Let's start over in the top left-hand corner and move ourselves around clockwise and look at these seating arrangements. So you've got theatre style, which is a pretty typical sort of style when you're having a large meeting, like a shareholder meeting, and you've got the key players up the front behind a table, and you've got everyone in rows sitting, usually with an aisle in the middle. Now, they're great when you want to convey information. So they're good for information conveying, both from the audience to the key group on stage and also from the key group to the audience. So that's fine. But the problem with that is that the interaction between the audience members is diminished somewhat because everyone's facing in a direction. So there's going to be very little interaction in the audience. So that doesn't, I realise in your meetings when you get together, you're probably not going to have an arrangement like that. Then you've got the classroom type, and the difference there is, of course, you've got something to write on, a desk or something, or a something that you can put your laptop on that can be very useful. So that can be very good in an education type meeting where you are getting, and this is how universities are often set up. So, of course, people can bring their laptop or they can bring their notepad or whatever. And so that's very much an information sharing. The third configuration there on the right-hand side is the U-shape, what we normally call the U-shape for obvious reasons. The U-shape is great when you're having workshops, and I use it quite a bit. the reason why it's so good is it does encourage interaction between team members, because obviously most people in that particular diagram are facing each other. So it's a little bit easier to have that dialogue across the table, and the speaker or the presenter is out the front, and they're not necessarily sitting behind a chair or a lectern or something. They should be out and about. So that's very good when you've got a collaboration type meeting where you want to get input and feedback from everybody. Underneath there, of course, you've got the cabaret style where you've got everybody sitting around a table. And that's a little bit more relaxed than the classroom style. And normally that can be done over a dinner. But I've used that configuration quite a lot with workshopping, where I've got a number of teams in the room where I can actually put each team at a different table. So they can have a discussion about a particular item or a critical incident, and they can talk about it in their teams. And of course, if you're running a cross-functional meeting, you can do a little bit of social engineering and actually work out who sits with whom, and that can be actually quite useful. And so it's great for discussion. The banquet style, of course, is much more formal because we've got long tables, and usually that's a dinner type arrangement, and normally there might be an after dinner speaker or something like that. Now, the problem with the banquet style, of course, is that with these long tables, people can talk to the person next to them and even the person facing them, but beyond that, there isn't a lot of interaction at the table. So that, if you're looking for interaction, that's not going to be the best way forward. And the final configuration is the conference configuration that you can see on the left-hand side. The left-hand side shows people sitting around a board table. They're facing each other, and they're working together as a team. That's probably a very good configuration for most of your team meetings, I suspect. So there's a few other different configurations, but I think it's important to think about this, because if you're having a meeting away, an off-site meeting, for example, and you want to let the motel know how to set up the room, it's really important you give that some thought, because how the room's set up will very much govern the communication that goes on in the room. So that becomes critically important. Now, it's a good idea in your meetings to have guest speakers. Now, I don't mean spending thousands of dollars getting a great speaker to come in, but what I mean is that you might get somebody else inside council who might come and talk about their particular area of expertise. Or if there's an issue that's going on that's impacting on your team, why not ask somebody, say, from HR to come and address you, or somebody from finance, or somebody from wherever? And, they don't have to take all day. They can just take 5, 10, 15 minutes at the most. And that can be very, very helpful as well. So, okay, so that can work for you as well. Okay. All right. Okay. So, it's, it's useful because the guest speakers themselves may wish to, use that as a forum to discuss certain issues. So they themselves will probably welcome the opportunity to come and address your meeting. Or what about using people in your team itself? So how about you rotate it and give everyone a chance to talk about their role and their responsibilities and the things, do it that way. And so that can be another way forward. So that spruces up the meeting a bit, makes things a little bit more interesting and lively, and I think that's a good idea. Now, one of the micro skills that I think is very good for you would be to use paraphrasing. Now, paraphrasing simply means that you kind of sum up what someone said. So this is a good way of keeping control of your meetings. There's actually 3 reasons for paraphrasing. So someone says blah, 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 and what you do is you then summarize what they've said. So you might start by saying, in other words, the main point you're making is that we didn't get the information that we needed, and therefore we couldn't make the decision that we had to. Now, they might have spent 10 minutes telling you all that, but in essence, that's what it is that they wanted to tell you. So why would you do that? Well, 3 reasons. One is it checks to make sure you've got the essence of what the what the speaker's point is. So in other words, by saying that, you're actually checking. So if the speaker thinks that there's more to it than what you've paraphrased, then they can then say, no, there's more to it than that. There's this, and this. So you've got that opportunity to talk about that. It also lets the speaker know that you've been listening to them, and that's courtesy, and they will appreciate the fact that they won't know unless you have made an attempt to paraphrase. And I guess the third reason is that you can then move the meeting on, because once you've paraphrased their point, there's no need for them to keep going on and on and on about their key point, is there? So you've already closed off their contribution in a very courteous way by paraphrasing what they've said, so you can move on to the next big thing. Okay, so paraphrasing is something that you should get used to. It's a great way of controlling meetings. Now, the other challenge I often hear people often say to me, how do I get everybody involved in my meetings? Fred and Mary, they want to, dominate the meeting, but Jim and Claire don't contribute. So how do I get Clem and, how do I get Clem and whoever involved and not have these other people involved and dominating the meeting? Well, here's a little strategy that works extremely well. So next time you have a meeting, you know who your quiet ones are. So when you're in discussion mode, because that's normally when you want to get everyone involved. So when you're in discussion mode, you might then just simply say to Fred, I notice you haven't said anything. Is there anything you would like to add to the discussion? Now, Fred's quite within his rights to say, no, thank you. There's nothing else I want to add. So he can do that. But it also might open the door for Fred to make a comment and prompt him to say something that perhaps he wouldn't have said otherwise. Now, let's take the former situation. Let's say that Fred says to you, look, there's nothing I want to add. So you might think, well, that was a waste of time. No, it's not, because everyone in that room thinks to themselves, well, if you're prepared to ask Fred his opinion about this topic, it's likely that at some point you're going to ask me. So that means perhaps I should be on the front foot and giving my opinion rather than waiting for you to ask me, because it's less awkward. So you can see that that's a great way psychologically to get everyone involved in the meeting, because you're putting everyone on notice that you could call upon anybody at any time about anything to see if they have a contribution. You notice I've been courteous with Fred. I'm not saying, Fred, I want to hear your point of view. That's a bit aggressive. But Fred, is there anything you'd like to add to what you've already heard? Is a far more appropriate response or question, because then Fred has an option to opt out or opt in, depending, of course, on what it is that he wants to say. All right, so I'm just wondering how the audio is going, guys. It seems that it might be up in North Queensland. Right, so look, let's just plough on. We're getting towards the end anyway, but hopefully this will all come out in the recording. Also, another useful thing for discussion might be that you might use what I had developed, which is a team values charter, which is something I had in one of my books that you can see down the bottom. And it's simply based on 5 questions. And it's a wonderful way to get involvement in your team and to also find out a lot about what's going on. So you ask them 5 questions, and of course people have to write the answers down because you want them to think about the answers. So question 1 will be, if there was one value that was important to you when we meet as a team, what would it be? Now this is particularly good for a new team, a newly formed team. So people will say whatever they want to say, but you get them to write it down. So let's say I wrote down respect. That's my value. The next question is, what does it mean? Well, respect means that I am going to be listened to without interruption from everybody in the room, that I have an important role to play. Okay, that's my definition of respect. Why is it important? Well, respect's important to me because I want to feel that my contribution is worth something in this team. So that's my answer on paper. What behaviours would demonstrate that? Well, the behaviours that would demonstrate that would be that I would allow people to speak, I'd be patient, I would let them finish their sentences before I interrupted. What behaviours would violate that? Well, the opposite, people jumping in, people cutting me off, people dismissing my ideas before they hear them out fully. And then once everyone's written that down, you actually get them to share that with everyone around the table. And you will find that that's extremely powerful. You've created a values charter that everyone has bought into. You can frame it, put it at the top of your agenda or whatever. And you'll find that people will be overly committed to it because they won't argue with their own data. So they've had an input, they've had a say, and they will quite willingly adhere to that charter. So that's something that you might like to consider. What about a win for the week? What about if you just simply asked everyone before you even got underway, one win for the week if it's a weekly meeting, or one win for the fortnight if it's a fortnightly, or one win for the week if it's a monthly meeting, and go around the table and hear what people's contribution is. You'll be quite surprised at the depth and breadth of what people say, and it creates an upward spiral of positivity, which is really more important. We're going to be talking about all the negatives anyway, so why don't we start talking about the things that people are doing well? Okay, so we're coming to the end. What I'd ask you to do is to take one or two of those ideas and run with it. Okay, I want you to try, those of you who, of course, chair meetings, I want you to have a go at using some of those strategies or techniques, and that's it. So, guys, thank you. Just a quick plug before I finish up. Peak Services, part of LGAQ, has another Lunch and Learn series on developing high-performing teams. It's starting just after Easter, so you'll have to get on your skates if you're interested. If you'd like a brochure on this, talk to Patricia at Peak Services, LGAQ, and she will send you some more information. But you can see on the left-hand side, if you're interested in building high-performing teams, this might be the one for you. So, you've got characteristics of high-performing teams, you've got the 4 stages of team development, some tools for leading teams that can be very helpful, the roles people play in teams, and how you manage conflict and negotiation in teams, and how you develop team culture. So it starts on the 6th of April, so you'll need to be quick, but also if there's anyone else inside your organisation who you think may benefit from a program like this, then please talk to Patricia at LGAQ, and I'm sure she'll be able to assist you and organise the registrations. So guys, that's it. I wish you a very safe and restful Easter.